America's meat and potatoes. McDonald's Quarter Pounder and Fries.
Hello, everyone. I know you've heard about this E. coli outbreak and McDonald's, the Quarter Pounder. I wanted to shoot a quick piece here for you and cover some of the things that I've heard in the news that are completely wrong, some things I've heard people ask that have been misplaced, maybe the wrong Google search or something, and just kind of clarify the record on a few things associated with this. I also had questions myself that you might have, which is, how do they know if it came from the burgers or the onions? Maybe it was from the lettuce or something else. How would they know that? And so I'm going to answer a few of those things for you. I'm going to explain some of the symptoms associated with E. coli infection, populations that might be more vulnerable to this, and then what you can do if you've been through any recent eating event where you've had diarrhea and gotten ill. So, quick overview, 75 people got sick, 22 people hospitalized. This spanned 13 states. And you might go, first of all, well, how do they know where it's centered? It's supposedly centered in Mesa County, Colorado. And here's how. They interviewed 42 people. And of the first 42 people they interviewed, 39 of them had eaten at McDonald's, and they'd eaten the beef burger at McDonald's specifically. 31 of those people had the Quarter Pounder. So how did they get to the onions part of this case? Well, here's where that comes from. The Quarter Pounder, it turns out the meat for that particular burger is sourced from a different source than where they get their meat, say, for their Big Macs or their other burgers. So number one, they knew it had to be either the source for those burgers or it had to be something on that. The second thing is on the Quarter Pounder, they only source these slivered onions from one place for that. So they knew right off the bat that all of these people, 31 of these initial 39 had eaten the Quarter Pounder. They also knew that on that burger there was a special source for the meat and a special source for the onions. So that led them then immediately to focus in on that as a potential source of infection. Now, what happens then when someone gets ill, when they go in? How do they then take the next step? I mean, after all, people get ill from many things. Well, the first thing is, in a case like this, the CDC and the FDA begin investigating. And they begin investigating because when people go in and they get ill, and I did this for years, they show up in an emergency department, they have symptoms, most common fever, bloody diarrhea, vomiting, they look toxic. We get a stool sample from them and we send it away to the lab. In the lab, what they do is they take the stool sample and they culture it for bacteria and then they DNA it. They actually look to see what the DNA is of that bacteria in that person's system causing them to get ill. And DNA is like a fingerprint, right? It matches back to a specific point, a specific place. Well, all of these initial people had the same DNA source in their stool. So that's a huge clue. All of a sudden, the FDA and the CDC, when they start these investigations, they can go, hold on a second. This is all the same family of E. coli from the same place, causing this in all these people. And that's despite them being in 13 states. So that's pretty, it's pretty remarkable kind of how our system works in that way. Now, let's talk a little bit about E. coli itself. Because I told you at first I was gonna dispel some of these misconceptions out there. Remember that E. coli normally live in all of our bodies. They're in my intestines right now, they're in yours, they're in the intestines of many animals. E. coli in itself isn't necessarily terrible. It helps with digestive processes. Gosh, in some ways, in the bowel, it actually helps with some of our vitamin production that we have. The E. coli also helps protect us from other harmful germs and other harmful bacteria. So many strains of E. coli exist, and again, most of them are harmless. We all have them, and in many ways, they're beneficial to human health. There are some strains of E. coli, though, that cause severe illness, like this outbreak that we're talking about here at McDonald's. These types of E. coli, they're often referred to as Shiga toxin producing E. coli, or you might see the acronym STEC, S-T-E-C. This particular type of E. coli produces a toxin, the Shiga toxin. And this E. coli can also be passed in food or in water from person to person. Now, as I said a minute ago, most of these E. coli and even the Shiga-producing E. coli originate in feces. That's right, in the excrement of both humans and in many animals, often like dairies and cows and such. So if a food product gets contaminated with feces, then we have this chance of passing on the dangerous type of E. coli. And that is probably what happened here. Now, how would that happen? Sometimes there's an area of sewage that drains down into an area where a field is, or maybe there's poor hand washing in an area, or maybe a piece of raw meat or an onion or something is placed on a cutting board and then cut without cleaning it properly. And if on the covering of that there was any of this E. coli, the bad E. coli, let's call it, then it can start to get passed on. And this, it's not rare, actually. You know, I think many people think, and I think the fear and the hysteria that goes out there on cases like this when there's a, quote, an outbreak across 13 states, is that it's something rare. It's actually not. Every year in the United States, there are hundreds of thousands of cases. I believe the last number I looked up, there were 265,000 cases of this type of contamination, not all E. coli, but various forms similar to that, across the United States. Now, how would you know? That's one of the things I wanted to cover. How would you know if you had been exposed to this E. coli and you were toxic? Another misconception I heard out there was it could be months and months later where you begin to get symptoms. That is improper. Toxic E. coli that you ingest, normally within 3 to 4 days of that, you're going to know that you have something bad in your system. You're going to get very ill. What that's going to consist of, most commonly, severe stomach cramps. I mean severe cramps, not like anything you've ever had before. It's usually associated with bloody diarrhea and sometimes an amount of vomiting that's so excessive that you're unable to keep down any fluids. The fever is often in excess of 102 degrees. And in people who get this ill, you'll start to see their color change. They'll kind of lose that pinkness tinge to their skin. And then in the later stages, as it progresses along, they'll often have tea-colored or dark urine. That's actually from blood products, a breakdown of blood products in the urine. They might even get abnormal bruising on their skin. This is that syndrome you'll hear, hemolytic uremic syndrome, or HUS. That's often the kind of the sequence that it will follow. These people, when they get more severely ill, become confused, they'll have a hard time mentating, they'll become severely dehydrated. And then ultimately this can lead to death, which is the case, unfortunately, of a family here in Colorado had someone die. Now, who's most likely to get ill from this and to ill to the point of dying? You know, I told you a minute ago that there's hundreds of thousands of cases of food toxin exposures here in the United States every year. So why aren't there a bunch of more people dying? The reason is that typically it affects people who are older, usually 65 or older, with the immune system started to fail a little bit. Someone who may have an immune compromised condition, maybe cancer, has been on chemotherapy, or young children, particularly children that are younger than 5. And so these are the groups of people that get the most ill. So what can you do about this? The first is the common thing. We don't ever want to be the person who starts this source of contamination. That means just good general common sense. Washing your hands after you go to the bathroom. Also at home, when we get food products, we don't know when we get them from the shelf, from the store, where they've been. Were they in an area where there was some of this runoff with some feces in it from maybe a local dairy and it ran into the field nearby, or a truck ran through it and it got on it? Remember, wash the food that you have in your home, particularly raw food. Other simple things with food prep at home, when you're using a cutting board, wash the board in between prepping. Say, for example, if you're making hamburgers, before, hamburgers on the board, to then your onions on the board, to your tomatoes on the board, to your lettuce on the board, a very thorough wash in between, or separate boards altogether, in addition to washing those components. Again, this is often spread through things just like onions, like they believe in this case. Remember, if you ever need to sanitize somewhere, let's say you were to get something that you ended up knowing was contaminated because maybe one of your family members got sick and went to the emergency department, was actually diagnosed with one of these conditions, with a toxic bacteria. You can sanitize these areas where they've been by using bleach, about a tablespoon of bleach in a gallon of water. If you wash any surface, that'll pretty much kill any of these severely harmful bacteria. When it comes to the actual food itself, like the meat, make sure you always cook your meat with internal temperatures at least 160 degrees. Raw meats are one of the main sources as well of this, as well as such things as unpasteurized milk, raw milk that is. Remember that, and I've already covered any of the fresh produce. Those are all sources of that. So in the case at hand, what's going to happen? The FDA and the CDC have identified that there's an E. coli strain that they DNA bacterial fingerprinted that's coming from a particular area. They then do what is called a hazard analysis and critical control point evaluation, HACCP. And what they do is they look for critical points in the food production chain where stuff came from, where the contamination could have originated. That's what's going on right now. The investigation is going on right now. In the meantime, in an abundance of caution, they recall all these products where it could be until they source it down to the one thing. Now, why then do law firms get involved? What am I doing talking to you about this? This really gets down to corporate accountability. It's very important that sources of this are carefully sought out. As you can tell, this costs someone their lives. It's cost many people weeks in the intensive care unit or the hospital. It'd be extremely expensive. If there's not accountability for these things, there would be so much illness, so much death across the United States. We have very strict protocols, stringent inspection standards. And I know they're a pain in the butt for business owners. I am a business owner. But let me tell you, they're worth it. They protect people. And yes, I have owned a restaurant before where we did cook food and we did give it, serve that food to people. It was our responsibility to make sure that they were safe. It's the responsibility of those that provide us that food to make sure that it's safe. Consumers have a right to safety. Remember, the producers and the regulators were all part of that safety chain. If there's ever any negligence along in that process, then that's when it leads to severe illness, death, and again, legal processes such as this. If you've been injured, if you know someone who's been injured, if you think it was from E. coli, if you think it was from this particular outbreak at McDonald's, there's two things really that are critical to this. Number one, did you test positive for E. coli? Did you go and have a doctor send a stool sample, most often the emergency department, that tested positive for E. coli? Second, were you contacted by the health department? You see, the labs where the samples are processed, they mandatorily have to report to these governmental entities. So if you were positive, it got reported to an entity, a governmental entity, that's the health department, and they reached out to you. So that supports that you did have the infection, and again, they can fingerprint that. It's standard when you present with illness, particularly with fever and bloody diarrhea. They'll get a stool sample. They'll look for this DNA, testing on the sample, and they'll identify the source that's like a fingerprint. Again, that legally must be reported, and that's where this is originating. So if that's happened to you in any way, if you're part of officially what is known as this outbreak, please reach out and contact us. I'm happy to answer these questions for you as a medical doctor and as an attorney, as someone who has treated people exactly like this in the hospital, myself personally. I'm very interested in this topic and in helping others. So again, please send me comments, emails, anything I can do to help or answer questions. I'm happy to get on here and shoot something else more informative in the near future. And again, this process is evolving, and there'll be more and more come out on this, and hopefully we'll get down to that exact source very soon. Thank you.